Good evening. My name is Dave Devil. I am the co-director of the Terrence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy here at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I'm going to be your host for our webinar launch for the book Solzhenitsyn and American Culture, The Russian Soul in the West. I'm the co-editor of the book, so I'm very pleased to be doing this, and I have some very distinguished guests, which I'll bring out in a minute here. But first, I'd like to say a little bit of a word about the Murphy Institute. We were founded here in 2003 as a joint venture of the University of St. Thomas School of Law and the Center for Catholic Studies. And we're here to basically probe the depths of the Catholic intellectual tradition, and that's broadly and ecumenically conceived, and to think about a lot of issues of public life in a way that actually does justice to the depths of the human tradition and the human condition. We are working here tonight to introduce this book, and it's not about a specifically Catholic figure, but it is about one of the great humanists of the 20th and 21st centuries, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the subject of our book. We will be plumbing the depths of this man, the 1970 Nobel Prize winner in literature, and we'll be talking with some very distinguished guests. With me tonight, she'll be on next after I speak, is my co-editor, the Louise Cowan Scholar in Residence at the University of Dallas, and the author of several books on Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, and Fyodor Dostoevsky. That's Dr. Jessica Hooten-Wilson. Later on, we will be hearing from Daniel J. Mahoney, who's the Distinguished Chair in Scholarship at Assumption College in Massachusetts. And finally, Gary Saul Morrison, who is the Lawrence B. Dumas Chair in the Humanities at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. That's a big mouthful. And I wouldn't ordinarily say where Northwestern is, but here in the Twin Cities, we also have a Northwestern just down the road from us. So I wanted to make that clear. First, I'll be giving a little bit of a history of how this book came to be and what its general idea is. Then Jessica will be talking just a little bit about the main theme, at least one of the main themes that comes through in this book of Solzhenitsyn as a writer and why he's important for our time. And then afterwards, we'll be hearing from Dan Mahoney, who will be giving a short introduction to Solzhenitsyn's life and career and talking about some of the themes of his own work later on. After that, we will finally be hearing from Gary Saul Morrison, who will be speaking on some of the themes of his chapter from our book, as well as some of his other work. Then we'll be having about a half hour of question and answer, which Jessica will be leading. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about the genesis of this project. Where did another book on Solzhenitsyn come from? Frankly, I shouldn't say another book because there aren't enough books on Solzhenitsyn. But where did this one come from? And the basic answer is the virtue of pietas. Edward E. Erickson Jr. was my professor and mentor at Calvin College in the 1990s. And Ed was one of the first figures in the 1970s to recognize the appeal of Solzhenitsyn in a way that was different from the sort of the bandwagon approach to this figure who'd won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Ed was himself a native-born Chicagoan, the oldest of 7 children. He was a down-to-earth guy who had become a scholar of 17th century English literature, Herbert and Milton and various other figures. But he had seen in the literature of dissent in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, something that was very powerful. And what he saw in that literature was not simply political literature, but he saw something different, a rising up of the human spirit. And he saw in Alexander Solzhenitsyn something that was much deeper than politics, something that was powerfully religious. He was a man of conscience. He was a man who saw the world in the way that it should be seen, who saw that the line that runs it down the middle of the human heart is the only true line between good and evil. Ed saw all those things, and he began to write a series of articles about Solzhenitsyn in the 1970s. one of which is in our volume, The Literature of Dissent in the Soviet Union, which was published in the great journal Modern Age. And he wrote a number of other pieces. In 1980, he published a book called Solzhenitsyn, The Moral Vision. And it had an introduction by the great journalist and Christian writer Malcolm Muggeridge, who was his friend. They had been introduced actually by Russell Kirk, Ed told me one time. And Ed had done something for Solzhenitsyn that was very important. He had interpreted him in this cultural and this religious and this literary vein at a time in which many people were beginning to see Solzhenitsyn purely as a political figure, purely as a Russian figure, purely as a figure of his time. And Ed saw that that's something deeper. In 1982, he wrote Solzhenitsyn and he proposed a one-volume version of the Gulag Archipelago. Solzhenitsyn's 3-volume, it runs to over 1,800 pages. What he called his experiment in literary investigation is trying to uncover all of the secrets of the Soviet prison world known as the Gulag. Solzhenitsyn, because of Ed's approach to him, accepted this offer and invited Ed to come out and personally work with him on this 1-volume edition of the Gulag. And he actually was very impressed at Ed's work there. In the dedication of our book, Solzhenitsyn and American Culture, we've included a picture of Solzhenitsyn with Ed at Solzhenitsyn's Vermont home. And we've also included some lines from the forthcoming Between Two Millstones, Book 2, Solzhenitsyn's memoir of his time in exile. And in it, Solzhenitsyn wrote, "And then there was Professor Edward Erickson of Calvin College, Michigan, with whom I had become acquainted through an exchange of letters after his book Solzhenitsyn, The Moral Vision, was published. He had been suggesting for a good while that a single-volume version of Archipelago should be produced for America, where almost no one was capable of reading 3 volumes, and that I myself should do this, or entrust someone else to do it. If I liked the idea, he said, it could be Erickson himself, and he would willingly take it on. I had taken a look at his proposal, and why not? It would certainly serve a purpose. Without the deeper probings in Russian matters and with the loss of historical details and some of the atmosphere, it could work well for the incurious or cluttered brains of American youth. And the assiduous Erickson set to work. Then I had to look through all the places he'd bracketed and correct his choices here and there. At the end of 1983, Erickson came to discuss the progress of his work. I corrected some choices, but to a large extent, he'd chosen well, knowing as he did the mentality of young Americans. He turned out to be well-built, big, sturdy, his face framed by a close-cut beard, with something of the ship's skipper about him, measured, very good-hearted, and concerned above all with spiritual matters. He worked absolutely selflessly, and to ease the procedure of negotiating with publishers, he renounced any fee. Again, that's from Between Two Millstones, Book 2, which will be released this next month from Notre Dame Press, just as our book, Solzhenitsyn and American Culture, is from Notre Dame Press. Ed continued to work very hard for the Solzhenitsyn legacy, and in several other books, his 1993 Solzhenitsyn and the Modern World, as well as his co-authored Introduction to Solzhenitsyn, The Soul and Barbed Wire, which was co-written with Alexis Klimov, and finally in his anthology of Solzhenitsyn's writings in 2007, which he introduced and collected with Dan Mahoney, one of our participants tonight. Ed was a loyal servant of the Solzhenitsyn legacy, and he had that absolute selflessness and that hard work that actually brought about a great deal of good in our culture, and a culture which really needs Solzhenitsyn at this point. Ed continued his work. He wrote a very well done piece on Solzhenitsyn at Solzhenitsyn's death in 2008. And he also continued to encourage others. He helped out with writing an introduction to a revised version of In the First Circle. For a while, his introduction to the 1-volume Gulag Archipelago was sacrificed and another author was put in place of him. But I'm pleased to report that in 2018, when Vintage republished the one-volume Gulag Archipelago, they put back in Ed's introduction to that volume, along with a foreword by Jordan Peterson. And Peterson's foreword is very good, but combined with Ed's, it's a very nice pairing. Ed was a great man. He was an intellectual, but he wasn't just an intellectual. He wrote to me late in life, and he said that he had a life that was dedicated to literature. And he said, my whole career has been devoted to relating literature to life. Literature is not a self-contained field of play. It matters for how we live. That view has been mocked by cutting-edge folks. As their sterile views fade, we holdouts have the road open before us. That was Ed. He was truly a great man. We describe him in our dedication as a Christian, a scholar, and a mentor. He came to know Jessica at John Brown University in Arkansas, where Ed's son was and is the provost of that university, and Jessica taught there before moving on to the University of Dallas. And when Ed died in April of 2017, Jessica called me up and said, you know, we really need to do something for Ed. Because Ed had spent his career dedicated to undergraduate students at Westmont College, Hope College, and then for over 20 years at Calvin College, he didn't have a Festschrift, one of those volumes that graduate students put together to honor their learned doctoral dissertation advisors upon their 70th or 80th birthday. And we decided that what Ed really required was a kind of memorial to his work. And we settled on an idea of something having to do with both Russia and America, two places, two traditions that Ed loved, where he was a great patriot, but he saw in the Russian tradition something truly important for our time. Because Jessica and I are neither one of us Solzhenitsyn scholars per se, we were a little bit hesitant about that, but we decided that we wanted to do something. And when we approached Notre Dame Press, they were very open to the idea, and they said that, no, maybe you should go with your original impulse to focus on Solzhenitsyn, because this would be a good part of their Solzhenitsyn series. And indeed, we decided that that would be a true tribute to Ed. So we set about gathering some of the best scholars of Solzhenitsyn out there, and we came up with a volume with 20 chapters. And one of the delights of putting this book together was getting people who knew Ed personally, or who knew Solzhenitsyn personally, or who were great scholars, or some combination of these things. And it was a delight when we were getting the book refereed to be able to have difficulty in finding referees for a book like this, because we had so many of the great scholars of Solzhenitsyn and Russian literature around in our book. And we were very pleased with that. And we're very pleased with the product that has come out. It is a volume that focuses, as Ed would have it, on literature as a way of connecting to life. And it has sections both on politics and on religion and on literature per se, and also the Russian soul. And I think that it's a great tribute to Ed, and I think that it's a great volume in and of itself. And I'm very proud that Jessica and I have been able to be a part of this. And I'm glad to be with you here tonight to introduce this book. You'll be able to read next week in my regular essay in The Imaginative Conservative, a longer account of my own love of Edward E. Erickson Jr., Ed, as I think of him now. It will be published next week. But in the meantime, I hope that I've been able to give you a little bit of an introduction to Ed, and a little bit of an introduction to why he's important to Solzhenitsyn studies, and also why Solzhenitsyn is a topic that we need to think more about. You'll be hearing much more about that as we move on to our next participants. So I'm going to hand over the webinar to Jessica now. Again, the Louise Cowan Scholar in Residence at the University of Dallas, and a very accomplished author herself, and a great speaker. So Jessica, turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. That was a great introduction to the book. It is a funny thing to have two non-Solzhenitsyn scholars who are editing this volume. But one of the reasons that we did this was really Solzhenitsyn has so much to say to this culture. It reminds me of that great line in Lord of the Rings where I think it's Gandalf that says, you know, things that should have never been forgotten were lost. And Solzhenitsyn, when people asked him about why the things had happened in communist Russia that it did, it's because men have forgotten God. Men have forgotten those good things. And so you can go all the way through undergraduate, unless you're a Russian lit scholar, you may never hear of Solzhenitsyn. I did not hear of Solzhenitsyn until I met Ed when I was 22. And he really proselytized Solzhenitsyn's writings. And from there, I was able to read his Reader, which he edited with Dan Mahoney. And I was able to read his essays, and I became hooked on Solzhenitsyn. Why? Because here you have a man who does not just profess things with his mouth, but lived things with his life. His work was artistic, it was full, it was rich. It gave us a kind of character and depth that is much missing from our current culture, and people who are protesters are often kind of cheap protesters, not really willing to die for their protest. But Solzhenitsyn doesn't have that. If something is true, you have to be willing to sacrifice everything for that truth, right? As T.S. Eliot said, costing not less than everything. And that's what we found in Solzhenitsyn. And so our book is not a collection of political essays. It's not a collection just for scholars or experts. It's published by Notre Dame Press, which is a very prestigious academic press, but it is meant for the common person. It is meant for people who need to know Solzhenitsyn's work and need some context. So in the work, we actually talk about those writers who influenced Solzhenitsyn, not only Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but also Chesterton, Tolkien, as Joseph Pierce points out. He was influenced by those writers. We talk about him as a political thinker, but also as an aesthetic artist, as a writer of great fiction. And we're so lucky to also have his memoirs, to see his life, to hear about who he was as a person. And so with that in mind, I'm actually going to introduce our two Solzhenitsyn scholars, because we have two of the great scholars in America right now, Dan Mahoney, who is the premier Solzhenitsyn scholar, and Gary Saul Morrison, who is the most popular Russian scholar in the country. And both of them have agreed to promote this. I truly believe because they know the necessity of not forgetting these good things. They know the necessity of not losing them. So Dan Mahoney, if you haven't read him, he's widely published. He publishes often in Law and Liberty, in First Things, in National Review. Most recently, he was the author of The Idol of Our Humanity, How Religion Subverts Christianity, and you should get a hold of that book. But he's going to go ahead and speak and give you a little bit of history about who Solzhenitsyn is, and then why he contributed to this volume. And then he'll pass it on to Gary and introduce Gary properly. So thank you again for joining us tonight. And I hope you will start making comments in the Q&A section that you see at the bottom of your page, so that when I come back to moderate the Q&A, I am able to have some questions for our speakers. So again, just come up with the questions as they come to you and go ahead and fill them in there, and I will keep track of them as we go. Dan, over to you if you want to start your video.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you to David, too, for those very fine remarks. If I only have 10 to 15 minutes, so I don't have an opportunity really to provide my own tribute to Ed Erickson, who was a dear friend and colleague. And I knew him very well from 1993 until his death in 2017. And he was all of those things that David said he was. And really somebody who dedicated the last three or four decades of his life to Solzhenitsyn's legacy, as David said so nicely. I'm going to start by talking a bit about the larger significance of Solzhenitsyn before I turn my attention more specifically to the Gulag Archipelago, which is the subject of my essay in the volume. And I would add that the Gulag Archipelago is a kind of perfect meeting point of all of Solzhenitsyn's concerns, as I'll make clear in my later remarks. It's an autobiographical work, it's a philosophical meditation, and it's an experiment in literary investigation. It's a great work of literature about real things, the soul and barbed wire. I often will go to a Barnes and Noble and I will see it in the fiction section, right? Because we've lost a sense that a non-fiction work can be a great work of literature. And there's more to be said on that theme, and perhaps we can discuss that during the question and answer period. In any case, December 11th, 2018 marked the 100th anniversary, the centennial of the birth of Alexander Isayevich Solzhenitsyn. In my view, Solzhenitsyn, I think, following up on what Jessica had so nicely said, he's a writer of real talent, of immense talent, but also of spiritual depth. He was also, and these are inseparable, the century's greatest critic of the totalitarian immolation of liberty and human dignity. He was a thinker and moral witness who illumined the fate of the human soul, hemmed in by barbed wire in the East and a materialist cornucopia in the West. He was a friend of the West, but he saw the dangers when we engrossed ourselves too much in everyday life. And I will add that the mature Solzhenitsyn remained remarkably faithful to the twin imperatives of courage and truth. He was no fan of postmodernism because for Solzhenitsyn, the cardinal virtues and the idea of truth were not metaphors, they were not poetic illusions, they were descriptive of the deepest realities. And he was a modern St. George who slew the dragon of ideological despotism with rare eloquence, determination, and grit. In the first volume of Between Two Millstones, his autobiography of his sketches of literary life in exile, he says he was always torn between being a writer and a fighter. And I think that really sums up Solzhenitsyn. A writer who tried to convey the deepest truths about human nature and the soul, and the political nature of man too, but also a fighter. He engaged in what he called an active struggle against evil. Now, Solzhenitsyn had two great missions, as he called them: to witness to those who suffered and perished in the Soviet prison camp system and accompanying manifestations of communist repression. That's the first mission. And to trace the roots of the Soviet tragedy in the great unfolding red wheel, as he called it, especially in the February Revolution of 1917 that preceded the October Revolution later that year and made it all but inevitable. It's not a conventional view in the West, but Solzhenitsyn, in a way, thought the February Revolution, by destroying the possibility of a rational path forward for historic Russia, made something like the Bolshevik Revolution, if not inexorable, then at least much more likely. So as Gary Solzhenitsyn will point out in his remarks, Solzhenitsyn was the author of two great literary cathedrals, as the Swiss Solzhenitsyn scholar Georges Nivat has put it: the Gulag Archipelago and the Red Wheel. And I would argue both of them are experiments in literary investigation. And I think it will take many decades to come to terms with either great work in an adequate way. And I just want to add this. I'm not going to go into it, but I've written about it at length elsewhere. And I can't think of an author in the West about whom more silly and even pernicious things have been written about than Solzhenitsyn. And they're mainly written by those who confuse love of truth with dogmatism, the active struggle of evil, as Solzhenitsyn once described it, with moral fanaticism. And I would add, among these tendentious critics are those who mock things Solzhenitsyn held dear: a self-critical patriotism, repentance for misdeeds, individual and collective, moderation or self-limitation, and what he freely called liberty under God. And these are all of Solzhenitsyn's enduring themes and commitments. And I would add that for Solzhenitsyn, uh, these things may seem naive to us, especially for those people who've dedicated themselves to avant-garde literary pursuits or sophisticated theory. But Solzhenitsyn thought there was nothing naive about them at all. These were the deepest well springs of the human soul and the human condition. Um, I just want to say that Solzhenitsyn, who died on August 3rd, 2008, by the age of 27 or so, after fighting as a captain in the Second World War, being arrested in East Prussia in February 45, spending 11 years in prison camp and then internal exile. By the early 50s, at the age of 27, he had, or yeah, but really right after World War II, he had developed an outlook that he always said he retained right until his death. A worldview deepened by his subsequent reaffirmation of faith in the living God near the end of his imprisonment at Ekabastus in the Kazakh steppes in the early 1950s. So, in essence, the Solzhenitsyn who interests us is the Solzhenitsyn whose spiritual and intellectual formation was not set in stone, but the firm bedrocks of his character and thought were well established in the early years of his imprisonment. Now, in the introduction called Inception to the autobiographical poem Doroshenko, The Road, The Way, The Trail, these were 7,000 lines memorized in the camps without the aid of pen and paper. Solzhenitsyn had already spoken of his burning desire to convey the experience of the camps to an uncomprehending world. And I quote from a translation of The Trail being prepared by the author's son, Ignat. "Oh, who, oh, when will learn about all this and staunchly write it down with lucid understanding, not with ire. The time to write is now, precisely now." So without pen and paper, in the camps, Solzhenitsyn, through mnemonic devices, he used a rosary made by some Lithuanian friends. He memorized 7,000 lines of an autobiographical poem that traced his trail from Marxism and Sovietism to, you might say, his discovery of the soul, his discovery of the drama of good and evil, and his return to a belief not only in, you might say, natural ethics or natural justice, human conscience, but also his deeply grounded faith in the providence of God. Now, my paper is dedicated to a discussion of the Gulag Archipelago, and I'm going to try to do this very quickly. Solzhenitsyn began work on the Gulag Archipelago in 1958. He wrote the first chapter, 40 Days at Kengir, about a great prisoner revolt at a camp called Kengir, where 8,000 politicals and criminals, thieves, rose up together in the spring of May-June 1954, the greatest prison revolt in the history of the Gulag Archipelago. Solzhenitsyn completed the work in April of 68, and he mainly wrote it in utmost secrecy in a cabin in the forests of Estonia that his old jailmate Arnold Susi had made available to him. He lost the KGB, he hid for 2 winters in Estonia, and he wrote most of the Gulag Archipelago in those 2 winters. And as David pointed out, it's 1,800 pages. And I think Solzhenitsyn truly believed that he was not just writing for himself, but he was writing, he had a mission to do justice to the experience of the Zeks who had been imprisoned and killed. He drew, as he later put it, on 257 eyewitnesses who were also, you might say, co-authors of the Gulag Archipelago. He sifted through letters. He interviewed eyewitnesses and survivors. In the West, he added 30 more eyewitness accounts drawn from memoirs and discussions. And in the 2007 Russian edition, the final edition of the Gulag Archipelago, he provided a comprehensive list with biographical accounts of all the hitherto invisible allies who made the writing of the Gulag Archipelago possible. John B. Dunlap, the Russianist at the Hoover Institution, called the Gulag Archipelago a personalistic feast because it recovers the human soul, human personality. The dead are not statistics, they're human beings. And I want to draw attention to a beautiful chapter in volume 3 of the Gulag Archipelago called Poetry Under a Tombstone, Truth Under a Stone. This is where Solzhenitsyn talks about poets. The most memorable one is a Christian poet named Silin, who he talks about in that chapter. And he pays tribute to these people who would be wholly forgotten. But Solzhenitsyn observes how in prison and camp, all are depersonalized with identical haircuts, identical fuzz on their cheeks, identical caps, identical padded jackets, and of course with their numbers, like he was Zek, was it 854? He adds that, quote, the face presents an image of the soul distorted by wind and sun and dirt and heavy toil. So the task of the philosophical poet is, in Solzhenitsyn's words, that of, quote, discerning the light of the soul beneath the depersonalized and degraded exterior of human beings in the camps. And I would say that was Solzhenitsyn's greatest task, not only to tell the truth about the abomination of communist totalitarianism, which began with Lenin, not the paranoia or personal excesses of Stalin. It was deeply rooted in Marxist-Leninist ideology itself. But this experiment in artistic or literary investigation, I think it's such a powerful work because it illustrates what Solzhenitsyn calls the sparks of the spirit that miraculously survive the assaults of ideology. So I think in Solzhenitsyn's view, human nature is more powerful than ideology. That's a great reason for hope. And God's grace is more powerful, as a chapter like The Ascent makes clear, than imperfect human nature. Now, part of my essay, my contribution to this very extraordinary volume, is an account of the Gulag Archipelago as a whole, but also of the two abridgments by which I think it will be best known going forward. One is the abridgment prepared by Ed Erickson with Solzhenitsyn's cooperation. It's an authorized abridgment. The most recent variant of that abridgment was published by Vintage in London in 2018 for the centennial year of Solzhenitsyn's birth and the 50th anniversary of the completion of the Gulag Archipelago. That book is now available for sale in the United States, but I'm going to tell you a little trick. When you go to Amazon, if you type in Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, it doesn't show up. Type in Solzhenitsyn, Jordan B. Peterson, Gulag Archipelago, and this edition, which is available for something like $17, is available. And this edition has the Peterson, really quite a remarkable forward, because Peterson shows how at work in the academy and the culture today is the same ideological Manichaeism that blames people for who they are, their race, or many other things, or their religion, and not for what they do. He sees that same structure of ideological Manichaeism. But Ed Erickson's 2001 expanded introduction is available. There's also an amazing glossary, and there's a list of many of the eyewitnesses. So I encourage you all to order that volume the same time you order Solzhenitsyn in American Culture. Now, there's that edition, the Anglo-American edition, and there's also the Russian edition prepared by Natalia Solzhenitsyn, which is required reading in Russian high schools. The two abridgments overlap about 80%, but there's some material of more interest to Russians that is in the Russian abridgment. The most remarkable thing, though, about the Russian abridgment, besides being very faithful to the letter and spirit of the original and making it much more possible for busy and distracted people to read 800 pages of the Gulag instead of nearly 2,000 pages, is the remarkable introduction by Natalia Solzhenitsyn. And there's many, her account, a really quite remarkable essay. You can find it in the as a appendix to my 2014 book, The Other Solzhenitsyn, which is coming out next month in paperback. But and also it appeared in the New Criterion. But anyway, just a word about Natalia Solzhenitsyn's introduction, and I'm going to try to hurry up a little bit here. Mrs. Solzhenitsyn makes, I think, the really splendid point that the Gulag Archipelago is much more than a historical treatise or even a great work of literature telling the story of the imperiled Czechs or prisoners. And she points out that this capacious book includes many genres: historical discussions, personal reminiscences of Solzhenitsyn's time in the camps, political reflections, and philosophical meditations. Especially the middle section, The Soul and Barbed Wire, 4 of 7. She calls it an amalgam combining each of these genres, with the resultant product being more significant than the sum of its constituent parts. At its heart, she finds, I love this phrase, an epic poem, one that recovers the great and enduring drama between good and evil in the human soul. David had already alluded to the famous remark about the line dividing good and evil running through the heart of every human being. It never remains static in any heart or soul. So we have to struggle with evil, but not in a Manichaean spirit. One of the great things about turning to Solzhenitsyn is he teaches us how, he shows us how to avoid the twin extremes of moral relativism, which is one of the banes of our age, but also self-righteousness and ideological fanaticism. So, as Mrs. Solzhenitsyn says, of course the Gulag Archipelago is a political book, and it is, I think Gary and I would agree, the most powerful anti-totalitarian book ever written. So it's political, not politicized, political in that noble and dignified sense. But Mrs. Solzhenitsyn says, what is the Gulag Archipelago ultimately about? And I quote, the book is about the ascent of the human spirit, about its struggle with evil. And listen to these final words. It's so true. That's why the abridgment is so important, because you get to the catharsis. That is a reason why when readers reach the end of the work, they feel not only pain and anger, but an upsurge of strength and light. A couple of final remarks. I believe that one reason why there has been a resurgence of radicalism in the West, including, I think, a shameful indulgence for Marxism and Marxism ideologies, is the failure to come to terms with a book like the Gulag Archipelago. I think if young people knew more about the sorry experience, the soul-destroying experience of communist totalitarianism, we wouldn't be confronted with a kind of return of the ideological temptation. I would also say the presence of the Gulag Archipelago in Russia today is a powerful obstacle to nostalgia for the communist past. As Ignat Solzhenitsyn recently said in a piece in the Wall Street Journal, there are patriots in Russia who say Solzhenitsyn is a traitor and Stalin is the true patriot. Solzhenitsyn provides a very different model of humane, passionate, and self-critical patriotism. And I want to say a word to young people and American young people. So here's my ending. I recently came across a interview that the Italian Russianist Vittorio Strada did with Solzhenitsyn in the year 2000. The end of the interview is quite interesting. Strada asked Solzhenitsyn, what was his message to the young generation in the West today? And Solzhenitsyn said, first, resist the temptation of consumerism. And I love this phrase. He said, work hard to develop a much needed interior shut-off mechanism, internal limits, like turning the gadgets off from time to time. Once again, we can hear this great advocate of what he called voluntary self-restriction. But he also warned us against historicist complacency, the belief that we're always entering a happy century. No more wars, no more tyrannies, no more evil. That's a great illusion. So Solzhenitsyn was always sensitive to the great harm caused by utopian and ideological illusions. But he ends his words to the young by saying, let's end on a note of hope. Life will be hard, but circumstances will never defeat the human will as long as that will is concentrated and focused on what is true. And my final sentence will be, Solzhenitsyn once told Joseph Pierce in an interview, contrary to legend that I'm dour, pessimistic, and despairing, he says, I'm a pessimistic optimist. He said, in the short run, I see many evils to be resisted and fought, but in the long run, I have confidence in the free will of human beings informed by courage and truth. Thanks so much. And I am going to introduce my friend, Gary Sol-Morson from Northwestern University. Gary is, in my mind, the premier Russianist today who writes at the intersection of literature and what you might call social theory. He is a wonderful chronicler of the temptation of ideology to distort life, to distort literature, to distort free politics. His writings on Dostoevsky, on Tolstoy, on Bakhtin are splendid. And of late, and I take some credit for this because I think I helped rekindle Gary's interest in Solzhenitsyn by giving him a copy some years ago of the Solzhenitsyn Reader. But of late, Gary has written a series of absolutely splendid essays and critical reflections on Solzhenitsyn's works that and one of those is his essay on Solzhenitsyn's two literary cathedrals in Solzhenitsyn in American culture. So I will turn things over to Gary, and thanks again.
Thanks, Dan. You're absolutely right. You did re-inspire my interest in Solzhenitsyn, and by your own presence and by that Solzhenitsyn Reader, which I really recommend as a good introduction to Solzhenitsyn. I came to Solzhenitsyn as a person interested in the whole Russian literary tradition, and Solzhenitsyn thought of himself as an inheritor, a developer, a fulfiller of that tradition. And the most important thing about that tradition is how seriously Russians from the 19th and 20th century take literature. It is the most important thing in the world. There's an essay by Dostoevsky reviewing Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina when it first came out, where he has the remarkable sentence that at last with Anna Karenina, the existence of the Russian people has been justified. That is, justified by a novel. I can't imagine an American thinking existence needed to be justified, and least of all by a novel. It's almost as if, we would think literature exists to reflect life, but in Russia, it's almost as if life exists to be made into literature. That is, the most important reflections on life are the fruit of life. And part of that is what informs the idea behind the Gulag Archipelago of an experiment in literary investigation. It's puzzling, after all, for the reason that that David Evil gave, that is, it's not fiction. So in what sense is it literary? But here you have to understand that part of the Russian tradition, which you get in works that straddle the boundary of fiction and nonfiction, historical novels, for instance, like Tolstoy's War and Peace, memoirs, which play such a large role in the Russian tradition, that the writer, because of the writer's special insight, can see things in facts that a historian might not see. You know, as one scholar put it, history is too important to be left only to the historians. And so by using the same lens, the same way of seeing that Solzhenitsyn uses to write his great novels, he brings together that insight into the facts of the history of the Gulag and thereby transforms it, not just from a historical recitation that you might get. There's a wonderful one by Anne Applebaum on the Gulag, but it's not a great literary work the way this is, with its profound insights into why things happen, excuse me, into the human condition, into what lessons you can learn from it. Solzhenitsyn, himself was extremely aware of this importance of the literary tradition. That's one of the reasons that, as Dan pointed out, he didn't like postmodernism or those Russians who turned to postmodernism, as he says at one point. I'll quote him: "A great writer cannot be a postmodernist or a novelist." Here's what he says: "It has once again become fashionable in Russia to ridicule, debunk, and toss overboard the great Russian literature, steeped as it is in love and compassion toward all human beings, and especially those who suffer." If you read the great Russian writers, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, that really is true. They're teaching you empathy with those unlike yourself, empathy especially all with those who suffer, right? And ideological fanatics can't feel empathy because all they see in other people are either allies or enemies. And the idea that you should see it from their point of view, feel from them, is a threat to ideological certainty. But it is exactly what the whole tradition of the realist novel, not just Russian, is built upon: entering into the minds and souls of people unlike yourself, from a different class, a different social milieu, a different religion. And that's what is so important about the realist novel, and what Solzhenitsyn allows you to do in a work of nonfiction in the Gulag Archipelago. Stalin is supposed to have said that one death is a tragedy, but a million is just a statistic. Well, Solzhenitsyn gets you to feel each of those countless lives that were lost or ruined. They don't cease to be statistics. They become real people. And you can imagine yourself in that position. It's an extraordinary achievement to be able to do that. He then brings up the question, how does such evil happen? After all, the 20th century has seen evil that the 19th and 18th century could not have imagined. Only Dostoevsky foresaw in the 19th century what the 20th century might be, what we come to call totalitarianism. But when the czars were around, Solzhenitsyn quotes the comments about how awful they were, and indeed the czars were the most repressive regime in Europe. And he quotes how Leo Tolstoy and Korolenko, another writer of the time, shed tears of indignation that from 1876 to 1904, the czars executed 486 people. And then from 1905 to 1908, another 2,200. Well, I think if you do the math from 1917 to 53, those totals would average what it might be in 6 hours for every day in the Soviet period. It's a scale unlike anything anyone would have imagined. And you have, of course, that kind of evil in the Soviet Union, in the Third Reich in Germany, and then spreading to China and Cambodia. Where does such evil come from? Because if you don't understand that, you're likely to repeat it, and also to miss something very important about the human condition. And Solzhenitsyn says many, many interesting things about this. When evil is committed, how do you get people to take food from peasants who are already starving and bloated near death, as was done during the collectivization of agriculture to millions, to treat the people in the Gulag as they were treated, to engage in unspeakable forms of physical torture, which he describes? How do you get people to do that? It's a really important question. And it turns out you don't have to go out and select a few monsters who are always present. No, you can get ordinary people. Not all ordinary people, but many ordinary people to do that. And one way is, well, he asks in one point in Gulag, why is it that Shakespeare's villains, say Macbeth, Iago, could at most think of killing a few people, whereas Stalin and the Bolsheviks generally killed millions? What's the difference? And the answer he gives is Macbeth had no ideology. And by ideology, he means here a political moral system that claims absolute certainty and the ability to divide people absolutely without qualification into good and evil. So that when those people are there whom you're going to torture or kill, they aren't people, they're enemies, you understand? They're not people, if they're not people, they're not people like yourself. They're people, that shouldn't be there. So ideology is one of the ways of doing it. But then there's another way, which is people living under these regimes who might be called upon to do bad things, try not to think about it. They try to become ignorant of it. Or as he puts it, they try not to think, not to know. But this, he says, when we do this, that is already, as he says, the ruin of a human being. And that's again why, as Jessica says, there are things which should not be forgotten, should not have been forgotten, because that's another way of not thinking. Solzhenitsyn remarkably says that Germany was lucky to have had the Nuremberg trial so that it could not forget. Why can't we Russians, he says, have had something like Nuremberg? It wasn't a misfortune, as so many people assume would be the case with Germany, to suffer through Nuremberg. No, it was a benefit. It made the soul benefit. We need that. Well, at the core of how we accommodate ourselves to evil is a way in which good, otherwise moral people manage to sign on to what, if they really reflected, they would know they shouldn't do. And this is part of his analysis in The Red Wheel of how the revolution takes place. He was quite struck by the fact that the revolution would not have been possible if it were only left to the revolutionaries. They had to have the support of good, non-revolutionary, progressive, liberal, educated, humane folk who would apologize for anything they did, even gave them money. And he has this wonderful passage where the hero of the series is at a gathering of members of the Liberal Cadet Party, who are all, saying the usual things that have to be said over and over again. And he venture something a little bit different, and they all, stop and stare at him. He's broken the rules, and he finds it very hard. He wants to, get back in their graces by, saying the right thing, so that, he's back in their good grace. Then he asks himself, here it is. I'm brave enough to go into battle and face machine guns, but I'm not brave enough to defy the opinion of the proper people. How can that be? But that is precisely what happens. And Solzhenitsyn, some of the best passages in, those early volumes of the Red Wheel are about the mentality that is necessary to create or to allow horrible things, horrible things to happen. Another one, is that scholars, instead of thinking of their disciplines as about discovering truth, think about it as a form of political activism. Their primary loyalty then is not to the truth. If facts don't go the right way, they don't publish them. If they don't even know about them. They sure not to know about them. And Solzhenitsyn has in the Red Wheel a professor, Andrzejewska, who will say, we must accept the conclusions as they come, even if they go against us. And her students who've been bought the political activist view of knowledge are truly shocked. They're truly shocked. Well, one of the core lessons that comes out of Russian literature generally, which Solzhenitsyn knew, you get it in Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, that you must not think of the source of evil as something alien, different from yourself. In the Brothers Karamazov, the devil comes and visits Ivan Karamazov, and the devil, instead of being a grand satanic figure, is just an ordinary guy, just like us. We hang out with him, we like him. The point is that evil is not different, it's not alien. We all have it, understand, within us. And one of the prime enemies of the errors of the Bolsheviks and all ideological fanatics is to divide humanity into those on the right side, who are the good people, and those on the wrong side, who are the evil ones, because then it's easy to get rid of evil. You just eliminate the evil people. Like, there's no reason to let them to live, right? And that's how you get mass killing. But evil is not alien and different. It is ordinary, and we all participate in it. And that's what that famous line of Solzhenitsyn really is all about. It would be so easy if you could divide people into good people and bad people. But the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. I'll just make one more point, that the Bolsheviks, in his view, took to an extreme the materialist view of morality, which is, if the world, Dostoevsky talks about this a lot too, if the world is nothing but a chain of cause and effect of material laws, if there is nothing beyond that, then there is no morality at all. There's no morality in the law of gravity. Is it moral or immoral that things fall at 9.8 meters per second square? It's obviously ridiculous to ask that question. And if we are nothing but collections of molecules, then that's all there is. And the Bolsheviks take that to mean that success in this world is the only moral criteria. And by success, they mean success for their party. And in the Gulag, people who believe that mean their own survival. But Solzhenitsyn describes for himself and others moments when you realize that in addition to this horizontal realm, there is what you might think of as a vertical realm where things really are not just a matter of the laws of nature, but of some objective good and evil. Whether it's religious or not, it's objectively there. And only if you really believe that will, when push comes to shove, when you're a lot of pressure, whether to save your own life at the expense of someone else's, only if you really believe that good and evil are objectively there, not just social constructs, can you do the right thing. And so this places him at odds with so many people in the modern world, with so many people in America today who buy the materialist paradigm. And it's part of his insistence that that has its limitations, not just consumerism, but in its moral quality of materialism. That's one of the things that put him so much at odds with American intellectuals and right-thinking people when he came here. But the more you've experienced or think about the extreme situation as he had experienced, the more you realize that you have to think of good and evil as things that are truly objectively real. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And now Dan and David and Gary are all going to be coming up, and I'll facilitate some questions. I really appreciate both presentations. I felt like I got to go to grad school tonight.
I avoided too much about Solzhenitsyn specifically because I have the world's greatest Solzhenitsyn scholar preceding me, so I have to be careful.
I got to tell you one thing. I love what Gary said, and he's made this point many times, is that while many things in Solzhenitsyn have their own emphasis and are a product of his own life experience, in very important respects, these insights about the intrinsic connection between literature and life and ethics, this message, that materialism, real materialism, the denial of the soul, the denial of free will, that he is building upon the Russian literary tradition, his great, and he always liked to say, he said this in his Liechtenstein address in 1993, that something Gary said too, that only Dostoevsky really saw the coming of totalitarianism, the great prediction of the devils, that if these morally and metaphysically insane views were instantiated in real life, 100 million people would perish. Dostoevsky got it exactly right, to the letter, So Solzhenitsyn is always in dialogue with his great predecessors. But as Jessica also said before, this kind of humanist, ethical, and Judeo-Christian wisdom has many counterpoints in the West that Solzhenitsyn was also familiar with. So it's not a parochial tradition. It's a Russian tradition that speaks to humanity as such. And that's so important.
And I think our questions are actually drawing the conversation back to America, which is the point of our book.
Sure.
So Gary was talking about how the not thinking is what led to the evils that people were committing. And Dan was talking about, if we keep having our gadgets on and streaming, we're keeping ourselves from thinking. And then one of the questions that has come up was, how do we respond to this current moment that we're in via these different platforms that are canceling people, shutting conversations down, creating echo chambers where people don't have the ability to think outside of the ideological camps that they find themselves in, right? So technology has that ability to only keep you within one conversation. So how do we draw on the wisdom of Solzhenitsyn to fight against and combat evil and combat ideology when we're really dominated by one voice at a time, right? Only getting to hear one thing, kind of being in our own echo chamber. So I'll start with Gary and then pass it to Dan.
Well, anybody who is really interested in justice does not shut down alternate views, because that most attempts to establish justice has either failed or been positively counterproductive and established injustice. If you really care about justice, you don't shut down criticism, you invite it. You want to know how to make your reform actually work. And the only way you can do that is to get criticisms, to get data from times when it's been tried and failed that you might not know about. The way you can tell that somebody doesn't care about the justice they profess to care about is when they shut down criticism. Then they care about the approval of their neighbors or their own power. Usually the former, but occasionally the latter. But what they don't care about primarily is actually achieving good, because if they did, they would look for the best way of doing it. and that means listening.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more than that with that. I would just add that Solzhenitsyn is falsely seen by too many people as a monologic author. In other words, he's Jehovah thundering from the mountaintop. And as I said in my remarks, Solzhenitsyn provides a principal ground for resisting both moral relativism, that materialist dogma that denies the objective character of good and evil, and the deep human necessity of pursuing truth, taking the search for truth with the appropriate seriousness. But he's also a great critic of ideological fanaticism, of those who think that they have the truth with absolute certitude, and that those who disagree with them are not only evil, but we might say ontologically evil, you know. And as Gary Vernon, Solzhenitsyn, I think it's page 27 of volume 1 of the Gulag, quotes a private essay Lenin wrote for himself on January 10th, 1918, called How to Organize the Competition. It's a truly frightening essay because Lenin, I teach it all the time, he refers to real and imagined enemies of the people as cancerous sores, as ulcers, as vermin, as atrophied limb. And one can imagine what one does if one's home is invaded by vermin, or if one has an atrophied limb or a cancerous tumor. But that essay famously ends with the great Lenin proclaiming the great ideological task of purging the Russian land of all kinds of harmful insects. Well, when you rhetorically dehumanize people, you see them as ontologically guilty, to be judged not for what they do, but for who they are, their class origins, their racial origins, as in Nazi ideology, you have invited people to tyrannize and murder with impunity, because as Gary said before, you're no longer dealing with human beings. You're dealing with people who've been reduced to something other than people to whom we owe accountability and reciprocity. So, and I would say, again, against this idea of seeing Solzhenitsyn as just the thundering prophet of truth, and Solzhenitsyn took truth with a capital T very seriously. That's why he disdained the postmodernists. But books like Cancer Ward and First Circle have a dialogic quality, you know, and Nerzhin, the autobiographical character in First Circle, and we have two really fine essays in the book by Jessica, which is has more of a literary emphasis, but deals with the whole of In the First Circle, and then one by Jim Pontuso with a little more of a political focus, but dealing with the whole picture. Nerzhin is a true seeker. He comes to believe in natural justice. He abhors ideological fanaticism, but his two great interlocutors, Solugdin and Rubin, one is a kind of a Christian, a little too rigid in his certitude, and the other is a friend of Solzhenitsyn, Rubin, based on Lev Kopolev, who was a fanatical communist, despite being somebody Solzhenitsyn liked. So it's very interesting in that novel, which is certainly a call to moral seriousness and truth-seeking and a great condemnation of ideological tyranny, that by writing, I don't know if it's polyphonic in the Bakhtinian sense, but certainly a dialogic novel where truth-seeking has to take the form of dialogue and not ideological fanaticism, moral relativism, or that tendency to dismiss others out of a false sense of absolute certitude. So I think it's good to remind ourselves that, yes, Solzhenitsyn, when he was in the West, I think was quite taken back by a facile relativism, a facile materialism. But his alternative was never absolutism. It was a recovery of whatever you want to call it, philosophical poetry, or the ethical dimensions of literature that remind us of the intimate connection or the intrinsic connection between dialogue and truth. Does that sound right to you, Gary?
Yes, it does. Absolutely. Had he been just somebody thundering there, knowing everything, the works would not be successful, as they are. You would have gotten heartfelt, meaningful, informative propaganda, but not great literature.
That's right. And that's why a very instructive line from volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago is, if you think this book is just a political expose, slam it shut right now. And that's right before, in the chapter called The Blue Caps, chapter 4 of volume 1, right before the famous passage about know thyself, about if only were it so simple that we could find the evildoer. So, that Solzhenitsyn is saying this is, as I said in my own presentation, yes, it's a powerfully anti-totalitarian book. George Kennan called it the greatest critique of a political regime ever written. But it's not just that. More deeply, it's an exploration of the soul, of good and evil, the drama of good and evil. And Solzhenitsyn was very self-conscious about that recognizing the objective character or reality of good and evil is not coextensive with moral fanaticism. And I think one reason in some of my writings, I have gone out of my way to respond, as Ed Erikson did, to so many of the tendentious criticisms of Solzhenitsyn, is because a straw man has been set up that creates, I think, a real obstacle for confronting his wisdom, his writing, his insights on their own terms. And once we get beyond that and allow, Solzhenitsyn once said in an interview with David Aikman in Time, he says, he was quoting various things that were said about him. He said, these people never give any quotes. I never said that. I don't believe that, But I think it was tough for Solzhenitsyn because so many things were said about him that fundamentally distorted his moral and intellectual vision and associated an affirmation of the objective character of good and evil with, the Inquisition, or, I think Arthur Schlesinger said, oh, he's just a Puritan fanatic. Or the other one Gary will know very well is people who have no idea who the Slavophiles were. He's a Slavophile. In Russian studies, instead of thinking about the complexity of thought, of moral vision, of literary grace and artistry in a Dostoevsky or Solzhenitsyn, you can dismiss them by saying they're Slavophiles. And that way you sort of cut off the conversation before it's really started. Am I exaggerating that tendency to dismiss?
I think you're quite right. I mean, the natural tendency, and it's not just with Solzhenitsyn, but many intellectual historians do this. They have certain categories. This is what a romantic is. This is what a realist is. And so if someone has one characteristic of, let's say, a realist, then they must also have all the rest. And you've got to, that's it. Then but of course, what makes a thinker great or a writer worth reading is when the writer where the writer goes beyond the category, right? It's only mediocre writers that really fit, right?
I think that's right. And by the way, related to this is, I think even people who adore Solzhenitsyn buy into the notion too much that he was anti-Western. And I think if you read Between Two Millstones, you carefully read things like the Harvard Address, Solzhenitsyn never saw himself as an enemy of the West. I mean, I think he saw himself as a friend of Western liberty, but somebody who was afraid. He said that he saw some elements in our intellectual and political life that resembled the things that he and Dostoevsky had criticized, the nihilism, the relativism, the ideological fanaticism of the intellectual class. And to criticize that is not to say that the West is a mistake or one, So I think one reason I'm very excited about the new edition of Between Two Millstones is I think you see another side of Solzhenitsyn who he appreciated the virtues of America, but his warnings were warnings to the West, a friend, a critical warning, never some kind of diatribe against the modern West. And but again, when you get these sort of accumulated layers of conventional opinion, then they sort of substitute for a careful engagement with the thought and the writing.
Well, we have a few questions that are actually addressing that right now.
Sure.
They are asking, I mean, we have an election on Tuesday, so they're asking connections between this idea of the Russian soul. What is the state of the American soul? Is there any sense of a Russian soul in this, in the way that we're handling things right now? Have we completely lost that, or is there a place for that kind of engagement?
Gary, why don't you start with that?
I can't answer that. I talk about what I'm a specialist in and what I really know, and I'm not a specialist in America and American politics. I feel out of my depths. I've got opinions, but like they're no better than anybody else's. So I'd rather, I'd rather pass.
Well, my friend Ignat Solzhenitsyn often says, people ask him, what would Solzhenitsyn think about Russia and Georgia now, or what would he? And he says, my father's not around to give his opinion on those things, and he wasn't primarily interested in giving his opinion on those things. But look, I mean, I think Solzhenitsyn was worried as far back as the Nobel lecture about the erosion of some of the moral foundations of Western civilization. And as I said a moment ago, he saw some genuine similarities between a kind of regnant progressivism that he talks about in the Red Wheel, as Gary pointed out, or even a kind of open moral nihilism. He saw these trends. I think Gary will remember this from Between Two Millstones, Book 1, but when he discusses the Harvard address, he talks about the sort of official reactions in the prestige press. And then he says, but I discovered this other America. I got letters from people all over America, ordinary people from small towns. He talks about a daughter of Polish immigrants from Maine who went to Harvard, who wrote a piece in the Harvard paper saying, we should listen to Solzhenitsyn. He's our friend. He's trying to warn us against losing our soul. So I don't want to politicize Solzhenitsyn in a way of saying, we can simply appeal to Solzhenitsyn's authority to support specific political commitments today. But I would say, to the extent that demands for justice take the form of indulgence toward violence, or the cancel culture, or a progressivism that closes off dialogue and truth seeking, I think Solzhenitsyn would be very, very critical of those aspects in our present cultural moment that resembled the things that he and Dostoevsky saw most frightening in the Russian intelligentsia. I think that's fair to say. We can't say what Solzhenitsyn's political judgment about the present moment or election would be, but if we keep the focus on his twin opposition to moral relativism and ideological fanaticism, I think that can provide powerful guidance for rejecting, on the one hand, a fundamentalism of any kind, secular fundamentalism, but also I think, Solzhenitsyn was a religious-minded man who also was deeply informed by, he was a thinker. He didn't blithely just sort of affirm truths and abstraction from the sort of rich texture of life. So I think the best way of approaching Solzhenitsyn is not a man who would give day-to-day judgments on political events, but as somebody who's, the soul. Yes, I mean, Solzhenitsyn speaks deeply about the human soul, and he was also somebody who believed, I think, that Russia, in a way, had its own, what the Germans call a Sonderweg, a separate path, but not radically separate. Russia was part of the Christian world. It was part of civilization. And I will say, Gary can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've always said, I think one difference between Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn is when you read Dostoevsky's writer's diary, or even what he says about the Poles in his wonderful House of the Dead, his autobiographical House of the Dead, he doesn't say very many good things about the Poles or the Catholic Church, who he associates with fanaticism. And Solzhenitsyn adored the Polish Pope. He saw himself as a friend of Poland. He had no prejudice at all about Catholicism, which is not always the case with his fellow Orthodox. So there's a generosity there. Solzhenitsyn's deep attachment to Russia was not in any way tied to hostility to other traditions or other expressions of nationhood or culture. Now, I don't want to be unfair to Dostoevsky, because all of us who have read the Pushkin lecture of 1881 knows that Dostoevsky too appealed to a kind of universality. But I just mention all these things because speaking to the specific strengths of Russia, including its literary tradition, is not a way of sort of chauvinistically affirming that Russia, Russia's identity has nothing to do with the larger Western or European or the world informed by biblical religion and classical philosophy.
Dan, you and I have talked before about Solzhenitsyn's deep appeal to these religious principles going beyond, his own boundaries, and particularly in his appeal to conscience. And we see that in the Gulag Archipelago in a number of places, and one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich. He's willing to put the good lines in the mouths of Catholics or Baptists or Jews, whoever he thinks has the truth, and whoever he's heard. And I think that's one of the more powerful things about his works, is that it's not only dialogic, but he allows the other people to get the good lines. And there's nothing sort of narrow and provincial about his work.
Two things. One, the notion of conscience in Solzhenitsyn, which is, I think, the key in a way to this moral ethical vision that Gary spoke about so well. It is neither moral fanaticism, but nor is it this relativistic notion of conscience that identifies conscience with subjective arbitrariness. For Solzhenitsyn, conscience is a kind of inner portal to that objective reality that Gary spoke about. So it's personal, but it's also objective. And yes, I think that's very true. Gary in his article has a nice, he points out, maybe Gary, why don't you talk about this, that encounter Solzhenitsyn had with his Jewish friend in the early years in the camps, where Solzhenitsyn was just couldn't take, he was still enough of a Marxist to think no politician could possibly speak meaningfully about religion.
Yeah, it's a really interesting passage because it deals with a really complex question, which is the different ways of believing something. The incident is that they've heard about, I think it's President Roosevelt has invoked God in one of his speeches. And Solzhenitsyn has said, well, good Marxist as he was at the time, of course, that's, not serious. It's just, saying it for political purposes. And this other prisoner who is Jewish says to him, why are you so sure that an American politician couldn't actually believe in God? And Solzhenitsyn gives his reaction. I realized, he said, I could have replied to him firmly. This is a quote, actually, but prison had already undermined my certainty. And the principal thing was that some kind of clean, pure feeling does live within us, apart from all convictions. I realized that what I was saying, the answer I could give, had somehow been implanted within me. And I might not really think that. So he said, there's belief and belief. He believed these objections, these marks that he could have given, but once he sensed that they were also implanted within him, he wondered what his true belief was. And without many of us, that's one of the reasons why, your behavior goes contrary to your sincerely professed, beliefs. I mean, one example that I typically like to give is, I have friends who profess themselves to be philosophical determinists who do not believe there's any such thing as free choice. Things are exactly what they have to be, and yet they feel guilt and regret. But guilt and regret imply you could have done something else. What do they truly believe then? And the answer is, it isn't easy to say. They truly believe in one way, the determinist view, but they also truly believe in a rather different way, something quite different. And that's the complexity. Belief is not one thing. And this is what Solzhenitsyn, I believed it, but it was somehow felt like it was planted there and wasn't.
Yeah. And it's interesting that was Solzhenitsyn makes a big deal of that in the Gulag. That was a turning point, and that led to a kind of reconsideration of everything: conscience, morality, religion. And he notes that this I forget his name. Was it Gamarev? Yeah. He says that this was a Jewy man. Give me an example from 200 Years Together, the book on Russians and Russian Jews. There's a discussion. There's a chapter dealing with Jews in the camps, and he says some Jewish writers say Jews had it worse in the camps, and he says I really don't think so, because he said ethnic Russians, he said, did not take after each other. It was a Hobbesian world and everyone was out on their own. But he said the ethnic groups were much better at taking care of their own. The Armenians, the Jews, and others, they looked out for each other. But he says, don't get me wrong, he says the two men I met in the camps who were the most admirable, the famous image in the Ascent of the Gulag, Solzhenitsyn says, every prisoner is faced with the decision, will I survive at any price? There's a big thing in the Gulag about trustees. Trustees are people who have the cushy positions. Like you work, you don't go for backbreaking labor 16 hours a day. And, and it's a big ethical issue for Solzhenitsyn is he understands that people want to survive, but he says it's not okay to survive at any price, because that always means surviving at someone else's expense. But he mentions these two men by name, and I just can't remember their names, but he says they had an opportunity to get these cushy positions, but out of principle, they shared this backbreaking labor. And he says, these were two Jewish friends of mine. He said, people mocked them in the camps. Like, what's the matter with you? Because again, it was that materialist ethic that you want to do whatever you do to survive and all of that. So, I think there are these sort of unpredictable moments sometimes in Solzhenitsyn where you're absolutely right. Like in One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, the man who expresses, I think, not exactly Solzhenitsyn's position, but the most admirable person is Alioshka the Baptist. Solzhenitsyn's not a Baptist, but there were many. That's why Solzhenitsyn always objected when somebody would say, well, this character is nasty, but he's a Jew or he's an Armenian. And he says, don't number count like that. Because he says, I really treat all these characters, all these people I met on their own terms. And I think that's really true. But I never have sensed in Solzhenitsyn any refusal to acknowledge that truth can come, as David said, from many different people, many people who may not share Solzhenitsyn's broad outfit, and people from very different backgrounds, people who are not, again, Solzhenitsyn, there's no doubt he became a Christian and remained a believing Christian the day he died, but he never associates wisdom exclusively with being a Christian,
in the Red Wheel, there's a priest, maybe the wisest character, Father Severian, right? And
Oh yeah, great character.
he tells a story about a folk tale about 7 brothers who went out to look for Mother Truth. And each sees her from a different angle. And so they all conclude that the others lie and must be slain. And the story ends, quote, they had all seen the same truth, but had not looked carefully. And tells us about, different.
Yeah. And especially since Solzhenitsyn cares so much. There's that great line in The Ascent where he's talking about the real line is between good and evil and not between political regimes and ideologies and all that. And he says, this is why ideological revolution fails, because it thinks you could just get rid of some people and we've expunged evil for the world. But it's very interesting. He said, this is a truth appreciated by all the world's great religions. And again, Solzhenitsyn is a Christian, but he saw that the high religions, the high ethical traditions of different sorts, all converged on some kind of recognition that the drama of good and evil in the human soul is at the heart of reality, and yes, that's the end of that Father Severian chapter, and it's a very striking episode he relates.
I feel like we could talk about this all night and continue, but it's 8:30 and we didn't get to most of the questions that were asked, so hopefully you guys don't mind if people just send questions or email questions to people, so the conversation can continue.
That's great. And by the way, for everyone who's interested, the range in this volume, I mean, there's essays on Solzhenitsyn's poetry. There's essays on other Russian figures like Vasily Grossman, who I recommend to all of you, the author of Everything Flows and Life and Fate. There's some essays by contemporary Russian writers. And there's a very nice balance of the literary, political, ethical, etc. So it's really quite a volume. I'm very proud to be part of it, and I encourage everyone. Here's your 2 books for the next month. I'm good at hawking good books.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in for this webinar. As Jessica said, you can send us messages. You can call, whatever. You contact us if you would like to know. And I'd like to make sure you were sent a link for a discount for the book in your email registration, but it's also there in the chat bar. So if you can pull that link out, you can get the book for a good discount for us. We've been grateful to have you with us. Thank you again from the Terrence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. I'm Dave Diebel. This has been Jessica Wilson, Daniel Mahoney, and Gary Saul Morrison. And we're very glad to be promoting this new book about one of the great writers of our time and one who speaks to us permanently and with permanent wisdom. Thank you and have a good night.